Hello, everyone. I'm Ravi Ramamurthy. Welcome to the 8th India lecture at the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University. On behalf of myself, the center, and Raj Chambadi, who's the Tunton Family Dean here at the Damore McKim School of Business, welcome to this lecture featuring Dr. Arvind Subramanian, who, as you know, is a former Chief Economic Advisor to the government of India. Before introducing Dr. Subramanian and the format for the evening, I wanted to take a moment to share some good news with all of you. As many of you know, the India Lecture Series began in 2017 with the support of an anonymous donor. The center and I are very grateful to the anonymous donor for giving wings to what was at the time a nascent idea that has since turned out to be quite a success. Today, I'm delighted to inform you that the center has received a generous endowed gift from Vivek and Vandana Sharma that will let us expand and deepen the school's engagement with India. The Vivek and Vandana Sharma India Initiative, as it is called, will support the India Lecture Series in perpetuity. It will enable scholars, students, and practitioners from India to spend time at the center. It will encourage the center's faculty to conduct research in India, and it will help create a community of business leaders in the US and in India with a special interest in India and Indian-American economic relationships. Vivek, for those who don't know him, was a partner at Thomas H. Lee Partners, which is a private equity firm based here in Boston, before he took a few years off to go work for and lead and turn around two companies belonging to India's Piramal Group that were based out of Boston. And he's now back working for another investor group called the Frazier Healthcare Partners. Vivek and Vandana, along with their son Vibhor, are joining us today from Florida. Thank you so much for your generous gift and for your faith in us, Vivek and Vandana. Today's speaker, Dr. Arvind Subramanian, also, I think, requires little introduction. I think many of you would know him as the former Chief Economic Advisor to the government of India from 2014 to 2018, which was a very interesting and important period in India's economic development. Today, he is Professor of Economics at Ashoka University and founding director of the Ashoka Center for Economic Policy. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And previously, he was a visiting lecturer at Harvard's Kennedy School. And going even further back, he's worked at the IMF. He's worked at the GATT, which is the predecessor to the World Trade Organization, and written extensively on topics relating to India, China, and economic issues in general. Foreign Policy magazine has named him as a top 100 global thinker. Arvind, with that, welcome to Northeastern University. We look forward to your lecture. To the audience, just one word about the format. As I think you all know, please turn off your videos and your audio, and please post any questions you may have in the chat box, which we will then funnel to Arvind. Arvind will probably speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, leaving us some time for discussion afterwards. Arvind, over to you.
Ravi, thank you so much. Thank you, and to Northeastern, Raj, Venkat, and now, of course, Vivek and Vandana for hosting me at Northeastern. It's a real pity because although this is kind of being done over Zoom, there is a sense in which I feel close to you because I'm actually in Cambridge, and so I can look across and maybe spot one of the buildings where at least some of you work in. So it's kind of a funny feeling that I'm both feel physically close to you and yet we have to meet virtually. But it's a great pleasure to be here. I don't have a kind of a great sense of, especially if it's virtual, of the audience. But what I thought today I would do, and I do want to leave time open for questions. I wanted to kind of cover three things, if possible. Three topics. One is just to take stock of where the economy has been pre-COVID, and then we'll talk a little bit about COVID. Then I want to spend a few minutes on this year's budget, which all of you must have interest in India, must have followed. But then I want to lead into what I think is kind of a new and defining and distinctive feature of Indian economic policy, which is India is kind of turning inward, as it were. And so I want to spend some time talking about that. So hopefully I'll cover all these topics, and then we can take questions. So that's kind of the broad overview. And I do have a PowerPoint if that's okay, because I think all of us are virtual. I think it might actually help us see some simple numbers, as it were. So without further ado, if it's okay, Ravi, I'll launch into the presentation. Yeah.
Please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've outlined the overview of the talk. And this is the sequence I'll be following. So let's start with the overall performance. Here I want to talk about the overall performance of this government, as it were, the BJP government. And I was a part of it for the first, 3.5 years until 2018. So this is also a commentary, an honest self-evaluation in some ways. And that's why, if I'm being critical, I think it has some credibility because, I'm implicating myself to some extent in this. But broadly, if I were to say, what has been the overall record of performance? And, I'm really abstracting. We can get into all the weeds. But I would say kind of three things. See, India has actually been traditionally quite vulnerable to macroeconomic instability. And, we saw it in, of course, 2020, which is, of course, which is a global pandemic. We had some rumblings in 2018, but we had a major mini crisis in 2013. We had a crisis in 1991. And so in that sense, we've not really escaped from what I would call, the Latinization of the Indian economy. Used to be very stable, and now it's become more instability prone. And the three sources of fragility, the macroeconomic stability, were usually food, the price of oil, and foreign exchange. But now on those three Fs, I think we are now no longer as vulnerable. And it's a tribute to the government that, they do believe in macroeconomic stability. I mean, the Prime Minister is wedded to fiscal prudence and not to irresponsibility. They believe in low inflation. So as a result, broadly, the record on macroeconomic stability in the last 4 or 5 years has been quite good. Low inflation. Now we have record level of foreign exchange reserves, $600 billion. So in that sense, I think the economy is reasonably well insulated. And that's why I think there's going to be, the prospect of major crises. I think India has kind of gone past that, at least provisionally, at least. Second, I would say the most impressive achievement of the government, there have been many, we'll talk about, I was part of the goods and services tax, connectivity has improved quite a bit. I think there have been some important actions. But if you were to ask me what has been the really new and distinctive achievement of this government, it's what I call the new welfareism. It's a very kind of distinctive approach to the inclusive agenda, to the distribution agenda, as well, or the pro-poor agenda, as it were. Very different from the Congress, very different from what you would associate elsewhere. It involves the targeted provision of, tangibles, not intangibles, tangibles like, bank accounts, power, clean fuel, toilets, and now water, power. And you'll see on the chart based on Nielsen data on the right, that this access has gone up considerably, even between 2015 and 2019, the 4 years of the government. Just to give you one example, bank accounts have gone up, shot up to, and this is women with bank accounts has shot up quite a bit. And it's now, kind of close to 70%. It used to be, negligible, even 10, 15 years ago. So I think this distinctive approach to, the new welfareism is, I call this both imbued with conviction and laden with calculation. It's both conviction and calculation. The conviction is, this is important for the lives of the poor. And I think that's certainly a part driving this. And then the calculation is really that, if you can provide tangibles to people and they see that and you make sure that people know who the benefactor is, it's also politically something that is advantageous. And I think, I'm not a political scientist, but I think all the people who followed the 2019 elections will tell you that, this did play a role in, the political success of this government. Of course, it's very complicated, but the sense that the government was providing tangible goods and services to the poor and actually implementing it well was I think, a big achievement of the government. I mean, but it's by no means perfect. I think the government tends to overclaim. They say India is 100% open defecation free. I mean, that's far from true. And also access doesn't mean people are using it all the time. All those caveats are there, but broadly, I think this new welfareism is, I would say, the distinctive government achievement, and because it's also part of a vision, of a broader vision. Where I think, the problem has been that over the last 4 or 5 years, really, the overall economy has been quite weak. I'm just showing you, because I expect all of you are kind of more proficient than me on the business side. This is a chart that shows you that, all the 4 or 5 governments in the past, what's happened to profits, what happened to corporate sales. And you look at any indicator, investment, exports, imports, credit, you will see that, in the last 4 or 5 years, it's been very, very weak. And just to be fair to the government, I think this weakness began under UPA 2, but the weakness has gotten even worse, accentuated. So the economy is really quite, and this was true even heading into COVID. And I think then COVID came along, and you will know that, India has been amongst the most affected economies by COVID. People predict the Indian GDP will contract by about 8% this year. But the reason it's been so severe in India, because COVID came on top of pre-existing weaknesses in the economy, and that's why I think the economy is very badly hit. The financial system was very weak. We had this huge migrant labor problem. Even today, I think 15 million to 17 million people are out of work. So that was the impact. Of course, the more recent data are showing that there's a kind of recovery underway. The crisis, the pandemic, the health crisis, numbers have been coming down very sharply in India for a very long time. So with the pandemic kind of more or less under control, and of course we have to keep our fingers crossed on this because it's so unpredictable. But it seems like the economy is set for a recovery. And it's that sense of returning buoyancy and optimism that underlies the new budget that was presented on the 1st of February. Now, I just want to, again, give you my sense of the budget. It's a very quick take on this. So my colleague and I wrote a piece kind of summarizing this whole thing by saying that, one way to think about what this government has done is that it's very good on, the hardware of, delivery of these things, tangibles, on, doing things, establishing, something that's kind of clear and tangible to deliver. They're kind of good at doing. But what explains the continuing weakness is perhaps, the software of policy making is kind of a bit weak. That is to say, for example, there's a lot of policy inconsistency. They enacted the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, but then they would, retreated from it. For example, they want to raise agricultural incomes, but at the first sight of prices going up, they impose all these controls that kind of, reduces farmers' income. The GST, very well designed and amazing feat of political cooperative federalism, but, some of the gains have been undermined by the complexity and so on. So in a number of instances, I think you could say, the policy consistency has not been there. And of course, more and more, the kind of statecraft that requires, working with governments, consulting, doing things cooperatively, that's also kind of, been missing. So all these intangibles, what we call the software, that's kind of gone missing a little bit. And to some extent, we see that also, in the agricultural crisis that's playing out. And so that was our kind of overall assessment. So it's in that context that one should see the budget. And I think the budget is, it has some very, I think, important and impressive, achievements. I mean, firstly, many of us have, said that, the government has been less than transparent with the way it produces the numbers. The GDP numbers are controversial. Employment data, consumption data, they put it out and they withdrew it. And the same was true of the budget. There was a lot of stuff off balance sheet. But, one of the, I think, really impressive and achievements of this budget is that the government has pretty much, not completely, of course, I think very few developing countries, really come totally clean, but I think they've made tremendous improvements in coming clean on the budget. Off balance sheet stuff is now, you can see it, the numbers are more plausible. So it gives you a sense that, there is kind of credibility in the whole budget making process, and in the understanding and depiction and articulation of budget policy. Second, I think there's a big debate in India whether we should give more stimulus or less, or start, winding down, because, India's debt to GDP now after COVID is going to be 90% almost. And so, ratings agencies, bond markets, and the government itself has been very worried about the increase in the size of debt. And I think on this, the government has done a very reasonable balance between, providing more stimulus and also being responsible. And the other defining feature of the budget is that there's a lot of capital expenditure. So it's a very kind of pro-growth kind of a budget, which I think is laudable in many ways. I think the big headline ticket item, of course, was that they announced that 2 public sector banks would be privatized. I mean, this is new, important, and radical because, not only have public sector banks never been on the table for privatization, even when Montek Ahluwalia has a famous phrase that, India, reforms by stealth. But in this case, it was just the opposite. It was kind of in your face, using the word privatization, which I know Indian governments, they've always sought recourse to this word, disinvestment, which is kind of a euphemism for privatization. But this time the government has come clean and good. And this is actually quite interesting and quite radical, because I remember, when I was in government, and Mr. Jaitley and I used to argue a lot about this because, I think I would say that, it's finally time to get rid of some of these public sector banks. And he would tell me, Arvind, out of the 530 MPs in parliament, not 5 will support this. And even if of the 5 who support it, only 2 or 1 will come out publicly and say we support it. So in that context, to go and come out publicly and say that they would do this, I think it's very creditable. Let's see what the implementation is going to be. So I think. On these 3 things, I think the budget has been really very, very good, and I think the government deserves a lot of credit for that. But in these things, there'll always be a but. I think that to me, the 2 or 3 things that I'm still a bit uncomfortable with is, while the public sector bank idea is, privatizing it is very good going forward, there's still a huge overhang of problems in the banking and the corporate sector. The RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, to its credit, very recently came out and said, before COVID, the non-performing assets were about 7.5% of total, which is already very high. they said, after COVID in the baseline, that 7.5% would almost double to 14%. So that overhang of problems, there's not enough in the budget, and the sense of how to tackle that, to me, it's still not sufficiently fleshed out. I think there's still some confusion. There's talk of a bad bank and stuff which we can talk about, but I don't think it's really thought through carefully or not. So that's one kind of reservation one can have. I think the other deeper reservation I would have, which is, I think, what I want to turn to after this, is that this budget continues the inward turn that the government has adopted over the last 2 or 3 years. There are more tariff increases, there's more protection, and you get the sense that the government has kind of doubled down on this policy of turning inward, thinking that Atmanirbharta or self-reliance is going to be India's kind of development, one key element of India's development strategy going forward. So to me, therefore, while there are lots of good things in the budget, and really it is a very impressive budget in many ways, announcing public sector bank. Remember, India's banks were nationalized in 1969, so it's like 50 plus years later, something that's long overdue. I mean, the government seems to have finally bitten the bullet on that. So I think that's but it's this inward strategy that I want to spend a little bit of time on, because I think, to be honest, one can't dismiss this so easily either. One has to kind of give the government credit for has it thought it through, does it make sense, and I think that I'm going to kind of try and persuade you that this is kind of somewhat unfortunate, and it's kind of going down the wrong path. So let me just give you a little bit of background to this, which is now kind of the last part of the lecture. As I said, I'm happy to take questions on all these previous parts. I've tried to be summarize it. There's a lot more going on. India is a complex country, so for everything that you say, I'm sure there are going to be a few counter examples, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So this whole turning inward, to be fair to India, is not an Indian phenomenon exclusively. The world over, there's a toxic cocktail of both political nationalism, both breeding and reflecting, economic nationalism. So China, it has embarked on this, what they call dual circulation, which is quite a retreat from what was being done, in the previous 40 years under Deng Xiaoping, which is a kind of really active international engagement. China now is going to be, create national champions. It's going to, regulate even its private sector a lot. You saw what happened with Ant and Alibaba. So these are all kind of signs on the wall that China is going to be much more nationalist in the way it approaches economic policy as well. US under Trump did the same thing. I think even the early economic signals, it's not as if President Biden is going to really turn away from that. In fact, I think his first act on joining government was to do this Buy America policy and get procurement by the federal government and to buy American. I mean, even if it's implemented or not, the point is the signal is not one of saying we're going to make the economy more open. US-China relations are fraught. Brexit has just happened, and of course, why should we expect India to be any different? And I think to some extent, India has succumbed to this kind of Atmanirbharta or self-reliance. So the question is, what are the facts? Why is it happening? Will it succeed? I mean, these are the kind of the three questions that one might ask. I think the facts are unmistakable. If you see here, essentially on trade policy, India has started raising tariffs and trade barriers enormously. So this is why it's striking. In magnitude, obviously, India is not going back to the old days of 50 and 70 and 100% tariffs and quotas and import restrictions and so on. But there was a consensus, for 30 years, that we would kind of gradually but steadily keep opening the economy. And I think that there's a reversal on that score. Now, I want to be clear, of course, that because many of you work in the financial markets as well, I think this turning inward India is happening much more on the trade side, because on the finance side, if anything, I think we're becoming more open, not less open. On FDI, I think the government has done a lot by opening up the economy, and of course, in terms of opening to mutual funds, private equity, sovereign wealth funds, I think India has gone a very, very open that way. And I'll come back to that tension between opening to finance and closing up to trade, which I think is a hallmark of what's happening. But on the real side, India is tariffs are going up, and it's not just that trade barriers are going up. We're also providing subsidies for people to come and locate in India. And very important also, a signal: we did not join a major trade agreement in Asia. This was an agreement called RCEP, which brought together all of Asia and the Pacific, including China, and India consciously decided to stay out. And we can go into the rights and wrongs from a strategic point of view, but from an economic point of view, certainly there are going to be huge costs to staying out, because even if you think, all of the foreign investment that's leaving China for all kinds of reasons and is looking for other destinations and havens, the attractiveness of then coming to a country like India and not being able to participate in this regional free trade area is going to be a cost which I think India has decided to bear. So I think the facts are unmistakable that we think we want to do self-reliance on on the real economy, and think that is kind of going to be our development strategy going forward. Now, there is a certain logic to this. I don't want to deny it, but I think it's based on three misconceptions, and this is what some new research that my colleague Soumitra Chatterjee and I did, and we wrote this a few months ago. I think there are three misconceptions driving this strategy. One is that the notion that India is big. The second is a kind of a diffidence that we cannot export. And the third is a kind of pessimism about the future, which says, the world is deglobalizing. In any case, what's the point in, trying to put our eggs in that basket? Because, in any case, the world is going to be a less attractive place to engage in because it's closing up. So I think these are the three kind of big ideas or assumptions that are driving the inward turn. And I just want to give you some quick evidence on why I think, one should not buy these assumptions, as they are. I think the notion that India's market is big has begun to seep in very, very consciously in, and it reflects the kind of success of India. 40 years ago, no self-respecting Indian would say we're a big market, but 40 years on, we've done very well. Just to take cricket, we call the shots on the IPL, not Australia or England. So in some ways, we have become big, and we are a major economic power. We are a big market, but I think this has been taken a bit too far. And I want to give you one simple statistic to show you. See, if you take India's GDP, it's about $3 trillion. China's is about $15 trillion. But what you find about India is that the middle class with purchasing power is a fraction of that headline number. And that's because the Indian market is big, but there are lots of poor people with limited purchasing power. And on the other hand, you have a few very rich people who actually save a lot, or they don't actually spend a lot. And if you put this evidence together, you find that in the Indian market is actually quite small. And it's just that it seems to me that there's a big market out there, which is world trade, which is $26 trillion, which is like 15, 20 times as big as our own market, why would we want to, forego the option of, trading with this bigger market and rely on a much, much smaller market? Big though it has become over time, I think we have to have a sense of perspective that it's actually not such a big market. I think the second, this is for me, the wow moment of our research. What you find is that in the last 30, 35 years, India was the third fastest exporter in the world, and not just in services, but in manufacturing. So, the idea that we should somehow rely on our domestic market actually flies in the face of evidence that we have been a very big exporter. The problem is that we've not been a very big exporter when it comes to labor-intensive goods. We have been a very big exporter when it comes to, capital-intensive and high-skilled intensive goods, including services. So that's kind of, the paradox for India. So it's not the case that we can't export, but it's just that we don't seem to be able to export, apparel, clothing, textiles, footwear, leather, etc., which is where our population is, which is what would provide the employment opportunities. But, we shouldn't have this diffidence that, we can't, and that diffidence that underlies this turning inward is also misguided. The third myth is that, the world is deglobalizing. Now, the chart on the right shows that it's true that in trade in goods, the world has to some extent deglobalized. But if you look at trade in services, actually, the world is globalizing rapidly. And my feeling is that post-COVID, this services market internationally, in which India, this is the red line that you see, is actually going to grow and grow, because if anything, activities done at a distance, which is what international trade and services is, it's going to grow, and India is going to have a lot of potential in that. I think even if you take manufacturing, for example, even if the world deglobalizes, we have to have a sense that we are still actually a very small exporter, smaller than Vietnam. So my argument is that, if we were a China and, facing a world market that's slowing down, it would be difficult for us to continue that because, we're too big, and the world is kind of politically very sensitive, to big traders in the current context. But we're still kind of 1.75% of global manufacturing trade. So the bottleneck is not the rest of the world in accepting what we produce. The bottleneck is us in not being able to produce, what we ought to be producing in terms of unskilled manufacturing. So I think, this is my the only kind of difficult chart I'm going to show you. This shows on the y-axis what is the share of a country in global labor supply, and this is the share of global unskilled exports. And if you're on the line, it means how much you export is close to, your share of the world labor market. And what you find is that India is so much below this line, and China is so much above this line. It's, in a sense, it's a chart that captures the India-China dichotomy of the last 35, 40 years. We export too little given how much people we have, how much unskilled labor we have. China produces too much, and that's been our deficiency over all these years. So this is, in some ways, both the challenge and the opportunity for India, which we need to kind of take advantage of. I think we should just step back and ask ourselves, has there been any country in the world after 1945 that has grown at 7, 8, 9% growth without 10, 15% export growth? And the answer is no. There's been no country that's done that. So somehow to think that if we want the dynamism of the 8% plus, which is what we aim for, the notion that we can do it without a global export market is simply, I think, fallacious. In fact, India's own experience shows that when our exports were growing rapidly, our economy was growing rapidly. And when our exports slowed down over the last 5 years, our economy also slowed down rapidly, as I just showed. So I think that, it's kind of, why are we, killing the golden goose that's been laying the eggs for us is kind of my thought. You see, and just a few final reflections on this is that I think people think of the East Asian experience and say, oh well, some of them also protected and the economy. We can also protect our economy and then hope to kind of become big exporters. And I think that's just not true. I think the difference is that the East Asians, even though the government intervened heavily in the economy, they were somehow able to force this discipline on their exporters, saying, export or perish, export or we don't support you either. So that ability, that focus, single-mindedness on exporting that I think the East Asians had, I think we are kind of losing sight of, and we're losing sight of the fact that the global market will always be much, much, much bigger than the domestic market. So I think there are also these subtle dangers coming from what's happening in India. I think there's the notion that if China can create national champions, why can't we? And I think that political and economic nationalism, and there are political scientists in the audience who know this better than me. I think it can be a deadly cocktail, especially if our own institutions are become big. My own fear is that if you create national champions that become too big, they can really throttle domestic competition. They can become too powerful. They can kind of actually set back the efficiency of the economy in ways that I think would be very damaging, both for our economics and for our politics. So I think that's the sense in which I think this Atmanirbharta, at one level, it's about trade and trading opportunities, but at another level, I think it speaks to the broader question of, do we want to create national champions? Do we want, the state kind of favoring some over others, which is what tends to happen if you have this kind of policy? And, whether we really have the ability to pull this off in a way that can be, kind of, successful, not prone to corruption, not prone to rent seeking, and all of those things. And some of these fears have surfaced in the context of the ongoing discussions around agriculture. So I think these are not issues that are going to go away. I want to end just with this final quote from, I think, Mahatma Gandhi, which I think is really, I think, what we should be aiming for. As he said, and this is true, he said this broadly culturally, but I think it's true also in economics, let's not be walled in. Let's, let all the forces of competition blow in, but let's have the, self-confidence to, believe that we can compete in this, open way. So my motto to us, if I can persuade you, is, that we should be aim for self-confidence, not self-reliance, not a kind of inward protectionist self-reliance, but a kind of outward self-confidence that I think our own history of the last 30 years shows, as I showed you, that we can, if we can do things right, can compete effectively, can inject dynamism into the economy, and generally can kind of deal with the world in a much more open, confident manner that's both good for us and good for the world as well. So let me stop there, and it's about 36 minutes, and happy to take questions from the audience.
Thank you, Arvind. Terrific introduction to a number of important issues. I'm going to raise the questions as they arose during your presentation. So some of the questions are going to pertain to things you said earlier. Firstly, on the question of privatization, there's a question about how Air India's privatization has stalled for so many years. So do you really think the banks will ever be privatized?
That's a fair question, because every year we consistently announce ambitious privatization targets, and we consistently run short of them. You know, my what do I know? What do any of us know? In fact, in terms of what's going to happen, my own sense is that knowing some of the people in the Ministry of Finance, some of the top bureaucrats there, I get the sense hearing them that the Air India thing is on a trajectory, on a faster trajectory than it's kind of ever been. So I'm going to stick my neck out and say I think that's something that we can actually see the reality happening this year. On the banks, I think it's going to be intentions are very good, but I think converting it going to encounter many more challenges because you see, I think the first challenge is going to be which banks do you identify, because you're going to have the classic dilemma. If a bank is doing very well, you certainly don't want to give it away to the private sector. But if you choose the banks that are not doing well, it's actually going to be more difficult to sell them. So that's kind of a classic dilemma of privatization. So let's see. The way to now think about it, therefore, is to see over the next few months whether all the steps that need to be taken to realize this, whether they are being taken consistently or not. Because this is not something that you can pull out of a hat and say, here's the memorandum, we're going to go to investors. It has to be part of a long drawn consultative process. And if we see those steps happening, we should have greater confidence that will happen. If we don't see those steps happening, I think the anxiety or the skepticism that was expressed may be warranted.
By the way, which are the two banks? Have they named the two banks?
No, they haven't.
Okay, right. That tells you something, doesn't it?
No, I think no. To be fair, I think that's something they can decide. I think you don't have to say it up front. I think let's give them time to see. I think we should give them some time to come to those decisions. It's just that there are lots of steps that can be taken along the way, which can reassure people that this is serious.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There are a couple of questions on the agricultural reforms and the protests by the farmers. You didn't say a whole lot about that. Would you like to say something more?
I think there's a reason why I didn't raise the agriculture question or deal with it. It's one of those questions that's actually becoming very difficult to talk about because in some ways, it's happening at two levels. You see, one, it's happening at the whole question of politics and the government and the opposition and what I call the software of government policy making and its whole approach to how it wields power and things. So the substance of the reform, which is where all the discussions should be happening, has become completely enmeshed with the broader politics of this government and what's been happening. So it's actually become very difficult to actually have a meaning, to kind of disentangle those two components and say, this is on the substance, this is on the process, let's keep these two things apart and then have a kind of meaningful conversation on that. But unfortunately, in the real world, you cannot disentangle the two. And because now it's got enmeshed in those bigger questions of politics, identity, power, centralization, and so on, it's really, I don't have expertise on the bigger politics. I'm not as I always say, politics is above my pay grade, but I think there is an important discussion to be had on the content of the reform. My only, two pennies contribution here, based on my experience of working with Mr. Jaitley and the goods and services tax, is that I am just perplexed that this government in enacting the GST it was a classic case of the center having to persuade the states, persuade the opposition to come together to enact a matter on which both the center and the states had a lot of stake in. So by definition, if it's a topic in which both the center and the states are implicated, by definition, you have to have a cooperative approach to decision making. Now, agriculture is one of those subjects. If anything, some aspects of it are exclusively state subjects. So in that sense, the lesson from the GST would have been, this is a matter that touches upon the states. One should do this in the spirit of cooperative federalism. And just as a personal thing, probably my happiest, most satisfying moment in government when I worked was, we had what was possibly the richest, absolutely fantastically substantive debate on the GST in Parliament. People now talk about Parliament having been, short-circuited, undermined, but the debate we had and the consensus that was achieved, and I still remember the moment when, when the voting took place and we all looked up at the screens, it was 400-0, bipartisan consensus on this. And that's why the GST, with all its problems, it has so much legitimacy because it was done in this cooperative manner, where that was the first lesson. I think the second lesson, I'm giving a long-winded answer, is that, and I don't want to, say good, bad, right, wrong, whatever. I think it's just those of us who've studied, economics, political economy, it is an iron law of political economy that if you are going to undertake policy that is going to affect, in fact, even take away existing entitlements, you have to come up with ways of compensating or at least reassuring those who feel they're going to lose out. In the case of the GST, we got this compromise because there were states that were going to lose out, and the center said, here, we have this mechanism whereby we will compensate you for 5 years to make sure that you don't lose from the reform. So this, kind of political economy 101, that, reforms entails losers, therefore intrinsic to the design has to be, mechanisms to compensate losers to get their buy-in. I think that's the second lesson from the GST that for some perplexing reason did not seem to have been imbibed in discussions on agriculture. But, that's all I want to say on agriculture for the moment.
Okay. We have about 10 or 12 minutes left, so I'm going to see if we can get through as many questions. We have a lot of them. This is a set of questions about what stops India from pursuing labor-intensive exports.
I think the honest answer to that is that, ever since, the 1950s, we put in place a whole bunch of regulations. And it's not just labor laws. I mean, it was a whole panoply of interventions. When the great Rajaji talked about the license quota permit Raj, what it really militated against was against size. I think apart from all the things it did, we enacted a set of kind of onerous regulations that basically kept firms small and prevented them from growing. It could be labor laws, which, had this effect. It could be anti-monopoly laws. It could be, just incentives that we provided. We also had these reservations. So because if you think about the last 25 years of the export successes, companies and countries and companies that export, especially low-skill stuff, they achieve scale. They have to have, 30, 40, 50,000 people working in factories, have the right infrastructure, have the ability in the modern supply chain to bring goods in and out. So if you can't do scale, if you can't have this, if you make importing back and forth very difficult as we do, if our infrastructure is weak in terms of connectivity and transportation, it's no surprise that we haven't been able to, achieve that in this. And it's not a fault of any one government. It's a fault of, 40 years of decision making. I'll just give you one, example. When I was in government, and because we were actively trying to promote this then, India's most efficient clothing exporter, he came to me and said, Dr. Subramanian, I'm the most efficient exporter in India, but of clothing. So he supplies to H&M, Hermes, all these retail shops. So he said, if I had I have this choice all the time, I never invest in plants more than 1,000, 2,000 employees, because I just don't have the assurance and the security that should things go wrong, that I will be supported, protected, whatever by by government, society, labor union, whatever, by the public at large. He says, so I just cannot afford to take the risk. So in fact, instead of having 1 or 2 big plants, he actually has 75 plants scattered around the country, producing competitively, but not quite at the level of scale that a Foxconn can do, for example, from China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a related question on services, because you alluded to the fact the opportunity in services could actually be very attractive. And is India's turn towards protectionism only applying to manufactured goods? And does that mean, therefore, the opportunities in services are still in front of the country?
See, I think that the opportunity in services are still there. But if you look at the data, we have still been gaining market share, but we're doing so at a much slower pace than we used to in the late 90s and 2000s, and even until the mid 2010s. Mm-hmm. And there is a sense in which, and I'm not the expert on this. All of you who work in industry will know this better than me. That there is a sense in which part of what has happened is the Indian IT industry, it was very good under the old model of, writing cheap code and cheap software. But, in the next stage of, where the industry is heading, I think, partly due to reasons of, not having enough skills, partly due to not, keeping pace with the world, maybe not a variety of reasons. We are, maybe we need to do more even on that side to remain as competitive as we used to be. I think there's still a lot of potential, but I think we are kind of lost a bit of ground, to the Israels and the Philippines and the Polands and the Baltic republics and so on, which I think we need to. But that is as much an industry problem as it is a government problem.
So there's a question about comparing specifically with China. The gap has been getting bigger and bigger as opposed to just remaining fixed. Meanwhile, China is having all these issues with the US and some other trading partners. So is this may be India's last chance to get on the labor-intensive exports train? Do you think India will seize the opportunity this time, or is it going to slip by again?
Yeah, see, I think that, to be somewhat rigorous and empirical about this, see, there was a first China opportunity after the global financial crisis, because by that time, China was becoming, wages were rising in China. And even then, firms had started moving out of China just for completely natural reasons. China's, wages were, whatever, $400, $500 per month. And China was just becoming a victim of its own success. So there was that first wave when firms left China. and we just, our calculation is that something like out of 150 billion of potential exports that left China, we got only about barely 10% of that. So we missed out on the first opportunity. The second opportunity is a kind of more a geopolitical opportunity, which has come up because firms now are also leaving because they want to hedge their bets against what China is doing internally, and how the world is kind of viewing China. So this is kind of now a second opportunity, which could perhaps be the last. Who knows? It could be the last opportunity. But here, if you turn inward, if you isolate yourself away from these value chains and the big markets which are getting integrated amongst themselves and we are excluded from, that's going to make that task harder, not easier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We got a few minutes left, but let me ask a question. Like many people in the audience, if you're from India, you've had a sense of frustration that India is missing opportunities that may not come back another time. And it reminds me when I think in terms of companies, there are companies you walk into and you get the feeling they're inwardly focused rather than understanding what's happening with the competition, what's happening out there in the marketplace. And everyone in the company knows there's something wrong. We're not getting our act together, but nobody's able to do anything about it. So given that you were in the government, and you saw all these actors, was there that sense of anxiety? I feel a tremendous sense of anxiety myself, seeing all of this play out, and God, why are we not seizing the opportunities? But was that awareness that, hey, maybe these are, we shouldn't let these opportunities slip by, or was that in fact really a sense that we're doing fine?
No, I think we should be. I think one should be fair. I think there is a sense that. I think there is a sense that the whole China moving ahead, and frankly, this has been exposed not just in economic terms, but also in kind of strategic and military terms. Now, this kind of disparity with China has been exposed, and my own sense is that a lot of the economic actions that the government has taken in the last 1 year, the corporate tax reform or the labor reform, even the agricultural quote unquote reform, which we've talked about, has stemmed from this realization and anxiety that we need to do more to kind of catch up. I can't prove this to you, but reading between the lines and even seeing how some of these things have happened, you get the sense that it has been the imperative has come from this sense that this time is different. We are being left behind, and so there is that sense of urgency, and I see that in these. I mean, you can argue about right, whether it was right, whether it's wrong, whether it's well done or not well done, but I don't think you can say that there isn't a sense, and I would say that sense has been heightened, if anything, in the last 1 year.
Well, I'm sorry to say our time is up, and I know, Arvind, we have another event session that we have to get to in a few minutes. There are many more questions. If it's okay with you, I may send you a summary of some of these questions, and if you could just respond to some of them, we'll find a way to get the response back to those who post the questions. Arvind, thank you for sharing your insights. You have a unique ability to attack important real-world issues, but with a rigor and a data evidence-based approach, which is always refreshing, but also the conclusions are not always happy conclusions, but you let the facts take you wherever they're going to take you. So thank you for another dose of that kind of reality-based insight. I wish we had more time, but we don't. Thank you again. I want to thank Magda Tracy for helping to put the session together. I want to thank all the members of the audience for joining us. Wish we had more time, but that's the way we feel at the end of many of these events. The India Lecture Series often leaves us with many more questions than answers. So thank you, Arvind.